Well, we all know that third round and later quarterbacks don't typically get a chance to start in the NFL. However, we have some unique situations this year in a very unique draft. All that and more today on a Dynasty newsletter show. I'm your host, Adam Wilde, joined by my co-host, Chris Allen. Chris, we're going to break down every, let's say, relevant quarterback in the draft this year and just talk about their starting potential. So, of course, that's going to lead us with Kenny Pickett going at only quarterback in the first round, no quarterbacks in the second round, and then we've got a plethora of guys third round and later to talk about. So let's talk a little bit about Kenny Pickett and Mitch Trubisky.
Do we have to?
Oh,
Does that not sound
technically.
depressing? I mean, does it not sound depressing like for a franchise as storied as the Steelers at this point?
Well,
Now,
they would disagree. That's their hometown guy.
I
Yeah.
get it. The story is great. The narrative is great. And of course, like watching like Mike Tomlin, like give him that call. Cause
Yep.
I would say out of all the coaches like in the entire NFL, like I would most likely run through a brick wall for Mike Tomlin.
Oh,
Like
100%.
like while he might have a number of just like bonehead like in-game decisions, like his in-game decision making is probably it's not on like a Sean McVay, Kyle Shanahan like type of level. But if you
Sure.
want and I know it sounds corny as all get out, but if you want to find a leader of men, like
Yeah.
that is Mike Tomlin, like to an absolute T.
I
But
think I've got three. I've got Tomlin, Dan Campbell as my dark horse,
that is 100% true. I
and
yeah.
it, and Mike Vrabel makes it in. Those are
Yeah,
my
I think
three.
I think Vrabel is like so much more of just like I don't know if he still carries like so much more of that like Patriots mentality. And I think he's probably like the only head coach I can think of that has kind of gone about the whole Bill Belichick like do your job like type of mentality without failing and actually having the success
Yeah.
like while the success to go with it. Like while he wasn't a former coach like under Belichick. I mean, former Patriots player, but
Right.
unlike any of the other coaches, like from Bill O'Brien, so on and so forth,
Yeah, almost all of them.
almost all of them have kind of floundered outside of the Patriots Patriots shield. But all right, back to the quarterbacks. So Kenny Pickett, Mitch Trubisky. I think even before the draft there was some concern with Mitch Trubisky's contract situation that he wasn't essentially going to be their, I guess, locked in starter like
Yeah,
for
the money wasn't
2021
quite
or
enough
2022 rather,
to justify that. It
more or
was,
less like just
yeah,
backup money. And if the
good
right
backup money, pretty
quarterback
much.
were to fall to them, then they would wind up taking their guy. And with the course, like the Pitt connection, I know
Hmm.
that Pickett was going to be like a guy that was on their radar. I know there was discussion about Malik possibly going there, but it just seemed like all along that this was going to be like their guy if they were going to wind up pulling the
Yeah,
trigger.
because Malik was supposed to be off the board by then.
Right. And I think that was the assumption.
So they probably did so much work on Kenny Pickett that they just stuck to their guns.
Yeah, but overall, I think this entire class was somewhat underwhelming, but I do think that Pickett had at least more of the raw traits that there could be something that you could pull out of him if you give him enough time to develop. If you wind up putting him in the right situation. I think Pickett had
Sure.
the highest completion percentage over expected out of the rest of his peers. I think it was like plus 7%. His like the rate of RPOs that they were using like at Pitt, like while not the highest, there was enough concepts in there
Mhm.
that if you wanted to try and fold an offense around him, I think like Matt Canada can work with him versus with any of the
Right.
other guys that we'll get to, like Willis, Howell, Corral, insert name here. I mean, heck, even if they want to try and do Bailey Zappi, there would have been just like more of you kind of need to give them some more time to develop.
Right.
So I get why they made the move, but it's just at that point in the draft, it definitely seemed like no team was going to take a quarterback in the first round. So it didn't seem like they were going to need to actually put themselves on the clock in order to
Yeah.
take Pickett
They
because
didn't
that's
get the
essentially what
memo, that's for sure.
absolutely because look at now what they forced themselves into.
Right.
Pickett almost has to play at this point with the way that the CBA has worked out and just with the general inclination that goes with drafting quarterbacks in the first round.
Hmm.
He's going to wind up on the field. Like at some point, like very early on in the season, even if they do try and say throughout the summer, oh yeah, Trubisky's look great. We brought him in here because of the things that he was doing in Buffalo. He's really matured, and we think he can be our guy. I give them till week 3 or 4. I mean,
Yeah.
unless the Steelers are
Why even
undefeated.
start?
Yeah,
Why even start him?
I would say so. So unless one, Pickett completely loses out to Trubisky throughout the summertime,
Yeah,
and two, Trubisky starts off completely red hot, there's almost no way I can envision a scenario where we're not seeing Pickett for at least 12, 14 games minimum. So
yeah.
it's just, and I think
If it's
that's kind of the I guess a poor plan on their part for how they've kind of
if
positioned
it's
themselves.
close, that Kenny Pickett has to start, right? I mean, what are you
Yeah.
doing?
Right. And they could have kind of foregone all that, waited until the following round, and at least not had to tie themselves to
Sure.
that 5-year plan and said that, all right, now the clock starts now. Because with any of the other guys that we'll get to, the teams can essentially do whatever they want. The development plan for a Malik Willis, Corral, I mean, any of those other guys, it can be whatever they want it to be. But with the
Right.
Steelers, the clock starts. The clock has essentially already started. It started the moment that they announced that that was who they're going to pick.
And we talked about it earlier, and this is going to be an overarching theme from here on out after Pickett is that there doesn't even necessarily need to be a development plan for the remaining quarterbacks on this list, technically, given their draft position. Now, there's the general you should have a plan for any player that you draft. Why would you ever draft a player that you don't have a plan for? But they don't necessarily need succession plans for these
Mhm,
quarterbacks. I mean, Malik Willis doesn't even need to be viewed as a future starter. People are already calling for him to start over Ryan Tannehill, and we'll get to Willis actually in 2 picks. He wasn't even the second quarterback taken. But the point being with these guys is like Kenny Pickett is in a position where they need him to start now. Not only did they take him in the first round when now, hindsight's 2020, but I mean, they should have known. Basically, the Steelers were in the same thought process as dynasty community, fantasy community, NFL mock draft community, NFL network. All the people who are even the insiders who are still technically outsiders, we all thought Kenny Pickett was around a 20, to the Steelers. But we also thought that Malik Willis might go at 2. We thought
mhm.
that Ridder might go top 10, 8 to the Falcons,
Sure.
lands with the Falcons still in the 3rd round. So, I guess point being is they're in a position where they need him to succeed right away. And really, if you needed a quarterback to put on a playoff contender, which is what the Steelers are, Kenny Pickett's probably your guy. Malik Willis has more talent than anybody in this class. I don't know if anybody really questions that except for maybe the Steelers, but there's no doubt in my mind that he was not ready to play NFL football right away. I thought that a team like, I think if the Lions drafted him, they wouldn't have had to roll him out there right away. They would have stuck with the Jared Goff, get us good draft picks situation. But any other team that went with Malik Willis, like he was rumored to the Falcons, if Malik Willis went to the Falcons, would you have been playing Marcus Mariota over Willis? Well, in that situation, no, maybe not. So maybe you just throw Willis out there and you just let him use his athletic ability. But otherwise, you probably didn't want to be in a position to start Willis right away, right? So,
Mhm.
okay, now we're in a situation here. Kenny Pickett probably should start right away. Mitch Trubisky's been hot in the NFL before. It's been a long time. He's been a backup, and we've talked about on this show how you get little to no reps throughout the season. So, if you want to talk about 2 years of Mitchell Trubisky not really playing football behind Josh Allen, okay, whatever. If he improved in the meeting room, like, okay, cool. But how do you improve on the field when you take 2% of the reps with the first team? I mean,
Yeah.
obviously you're playing football, you're playing against second team, but he didn't play on a football field. He didn't start games. So I don't see how he could be that improved. I think we're going to see mostly old Mitchell Trubisky and Kenny Pickett minus will start over old Mitchell Trubisky. So that gets us out of the range of talking about starters, but some of these guys might get starts this season, and this next player, I think he probably does. I think the odds would probably be minus 110. That well, maybe they're even, but for Desmond Ridder, he got drafted in the 3rd round as the second quarterback off the board to the Falcons. For Desmond Ridder, he's got a relatively clear path. You've got Marcus Mariota on a 2-year deal. So you bring Desmond Ridder in the 3rd round. And might I add, before I kick it to you, that one of the things coaches liked about Desmond Ridder is that he had what was it, a plan to overtake starting quarterbacks in his meetings. He brought that
Mhm.
plan with him. maybe the Falcons thought that was a good plan and maybe it'll work. So what do you think about Desmond Ridder with the Falcons?
Well, I think it's a different conversation, like when you start to talk about the rest of these guys, because like we were saying beforehand, they have day two or day three like draft capital. I mean,
Yeah.
essentially outside of the range where there is no clock. Like we don't know like what the timer or development plan is going to be for any of them.
Right.
So while from a dynasty standpoint, like Pickett will almost guaranteed have the most value, he even has some redraft appeal, like for some
Yep.
folks as well. So it becomes a more difficult story to tell yourself of how do these guys like get on the field. Like I can tell myself that story of how Desmond Ridder, like even with some of the warts like to his game, we saw him crumble like under the pressure, like when having to play against tougher competition. And his like completion percentage over expected, like while decent in some games, like overall, I think he was second or third, like in this class. Like the mobility is obviously there. So there are things around him that, or at least traits about him that we can project for him to be a good fantasy quarterback. But how does that translate to him being a good NFL quarterback? Like, how does that translate to the Falcons actually being able to evaluate him and saying, okay, yeah, I mean, I know we only, gave you like we only spent a third round pick on you, but you could be a guy that we can wind up at least like taking into the future and
Hmm.
trying to develop and seeing if we can actually make you the franchise quarterback. But at this point in the Falcons franchise history, I mean, they've got a ways to go in terms of where they're going to be at from rebuilding this franchise. I mean, they've more or less torn things down to the studs,
Pretty
with
much. They
where they're at right now.
can't
And
afford to build the house right now.
I would say like they're at least they're moving in the right direction.
Sure.
They are still paying Julio Jones and Matt Ryan like on their
Hmm.
contracts. So it's like they still are probably like 1 to 2 years away from at least putting their roster back in a position where they can like accurately evaluate these quarterbacks. Because what are we really expecting out, like not just out of the Falcons quarterbacks, like what are we expecting out of the Falcons, period? Like
Right.
3, 4 wins. I mean, shoot, like
Yeah.
at this point, while it looks cool talking about the fact that you've got what like Drake London at what like 6'4", Kyle Pitts at 6'2", essentially like
Hmm.
when they come off the bus, it looks like a couple of shooting guards like coming off the bus.
Right.
And it's cool and all. And this whole train just might be running on good vibes, but overall, like how are the Falcons going to be able to evaluate what they have or what they need like for next season? I think that's where it becomes a difficult sell because if it's even a possibility that Marcus Mariota could start a few games here or there, like I would say 4 to 6 games is at least in the realm of discussion or in the realm of possibility for Mariota. So then what? Ritter only gets like maybe half of those games. And depending on injuries, depending on game situation, depending on the opposing defense, how are you going to be able to accurately sum up, well, this kid is good or this kid is just not where we need him to be? Like, how can you really evaluate him unless you're going to give him those reps? So, where they're at right now, I think even from a dynasty standpoint, it becomes difficult for me to say, yes, I want to be in on Desmond Ridder. Of course, the tools are there. You can sell me on the fantasy upside all day long. But without even knowing what the Falcons' plan for him is going to be, how can we even come up with our own plan for how we're going to evaluate him and why we should want to invest in him this year? I just can't figure that out.
And when we're in dynasty drafts, we'll start with Superflex since it seems to be more popular at this point, at least to the community that we usually are working with. You have to ask yourself the right questions to land on the right answers, or else you're just not going to hit on these guys and get massive value. So the question you really need to ask yourself is not so much can Desmond Ridder be an NFL caliber quarterback? Can Malik Willis be an NFL caliber quarterback? The question you need to ask yourself in your rookie drafts is can they get on the field?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's hard to prove in practice. I mean, you can light it up against the starting defense maybe, and sometimes that works to get you on the field, but
I don't know for the
more or
Falcons,
less
that might not be a big deal. I mean, looking at their
sure,
defense.
and more or less it becomes the situation like with Russell Wilson or with Dak Prescott where you start winning it over in camp,
Yeah.
because in camp is where you're gonna get your first team reps regardless, just because they're gonna wanna see you, especially when Marcus Mariota's the starter. He's only on a 2-year deal. He's not part of the big picture. Now the thing is with Desmond Ridder, I think that he has the best chance to get on the I would compare his chances of getting on the field not quite to Pickett because there's that incentive that you have to prove your first round pick was worth it,
Right.
but it's not that far off from Pickett. And here's the reason, because Marcus Mariota is on a 2-year deal, but I believe that you brought in Kyle Pitts last year and Drake London this year for your 2023 quarterback. That has to
Mm,
be their plan. If Arthur Smith's going to be the coach long term, they talked about this 2 years ago, flat out. They said 2022, no quarterback for us. It just won't be there. So when you took Kyle Pitts and then you followed it up with Drake London, you were preparing for your 2023, like the next Andrew Luck, right? So you need to see what you've got in Desmond Ridder, because if Desmond Ridder pulls a Russell Wilson or a Dak Prescott, then okay, wow, now you've got maybe a top 5 pick in 2023, and it doesn't have to be one of those, next Andrew Lucks. And so that to me shows that you kind of have to see what you have in Desmond Ridder this year, because there's nothing else for the Falcons to do. They're they're the Jaguars this year, but without Trevor Lawrence, right? So
mhm.
you're talking about 3, 4 wins, and you do have some exciting players. I mean, hell, even Cordell Patterson's an exciting player. I mean, we
Yeah.
love Auden Tate. Um, Brian Edwards could do something with his career. Perhaps he's talented. At least he was. So there's things you can do, but why do you want to win games as the Falcons? So I look at this, and so Desmond Ritter's my quarterback 2 now. Malik Willis was my quarterback 1. Kenny Pickett was actually my quarterback 3, and I don't think that was that weird of a take. So now it's got to be. It basically goes by draft order, not because I defer to the NFL draft, but that's just how it worked out. So Kenny Pickett's my 1, Desmond Ritter's my 2 over Malik Willis, and I just think it's because he plays ball this year. He's got to, in my opinion. So when I'm in rookie drafts, I'm looking at Desmond Ridder. And as weird as it may sound to draft a 3rd round quarterback in 1 QB, if you get to the 5th round of your 1 QB, I don't mind taking
Mhm.
Desmond Ridder. I don't mind it at all. So that's going to take us to our 3rd quarterback drafted. That's Malik Willis. He was our quarterback 1. He was most people's quarterback 1 going into the draft. We don't know what the NFL did, but it was something very, very strange this year. He lands with the Tennessee Titans. Ryan Tannehill apparently is not going to mentor him. Who cares
Yeah.
if Ryan Tannehill mentors him or not? But that being said, Ryan Tannehill's got a little bit of dead cap attached to him, and he hasn't really played that bad football, to be quite honest with you. So, what are we thinking when we're looking at Malik Willis's prospects of being something relevant in the NFL?
I think all right, so recording this on May 18th. Draft was just just a few weeks ago.
Yep.
And the situation that I'll like compare this to is you're going through a bad breakup. Like it
Mm,
just happened, and the thing you were expecting, which would be to go through just a long-term and just a wonderful relationship, has just now come to an end. And you're just now trying to, I guess, retroactively look back and say, well, I should never have believed this to begin with. I should never have thought this. And you're just trying to like beat yourself up over the fact, like, why did you believe this in the first place? And it just pushes you further and further from even entertaining the idea of being around like that person, like ever again. And this is essentially the takes that I'm seeing on Malik Willis at this point. It's like we talked ourselves into the fantasy upside of Malik Willis, like the rushing, and you could squint and see like a path for him to being a good quarterback. Like he gets put in the right situation. We know the speed, like we know the rushing upside and the passing. While I mean, it definitely had its flaws. Completion percentage over expected was fairly low. The amount of his like adjusted sack rate was one of the highest like in the class, especially like any. It's even worse when compared that or when looking at the fact that he is mobile. So putting all those things into context and now seeing on draft day, seeing him fall out of not just the first round but into the 3rd round. And
yep.
then not on top of that, to make things matters even worse, he goes to a team that doesn't even have a ton of passing volume. I mean, they're like the Titans. I mean, dead last in neutral passing rate. So on early downs, like over the past 2 seasons, like back to back. So you're not getting the passing volume, even once you see him get on the field. And then 2, the rushing upside now becomes, I mean, neutralized because it's the Derrick Henry show, at least for the next, let's say, 2-ish years for Henry, considering that I think that's when his contract runs out. If I remember correctly, he's a free agent after the 2023 season. So You just couldn't ask for a worse situation after us propping up Malik Willis as the quarterback one, seeing the upside and all that. He now not only gets the bad draft capital, but gets puts in a worse situation. So now we want to be rid of him. We want to talk ourselves out of like even considering him like in the future. Where at least in my mind, the answer is probably somewhere in the middle. Like he could be a good quarterback. I mean, and most folks would probably squint and see a path for him getting on the field, maybe for a couple of games, like towards the end of this season. Because looking at where the Titans are at, I mean, almost every other AFC team, and even some NFC teams too, they attempted to either do a soft reset or
Mhm.
just reload on the position. Look at what the Chiefs did, like with Tyreek Hill. And they just like move him over and then they reload at the position, like bring in MVS and Sky Moore, Juju Smith Schuster, so on and so forth. And so many other teams are trying to do that, but that's not what the Titans did. I mean, sure, they drafted Treylon Burks, but they didn't go out and wholesale like make these moves to at least say to the league, like with their wallets, that they were still a contending team after being the number one seed in the AFC last year. Remember that.
Yep.
So this is not a team that's like trying to essentially be the like New Orleans Saints and saying that, well, we can still be contenders like
Yeah, do
in
it
the
every
league.
year.
No, like they're not doing that. They didn't make a
Right.
whole bunch of moves. They didn't like waste a whole bunch of draft capital. Was it like the 5 picks that they turned into Chris Olave for the Saints? Like they're not doing that. Like they're essentially saying like this is what we've got. We've got our core players like Ryan Tannehill, Derrick Henry, Simmons, Dupree, like those guys that we've got these guys, and this is what we're going to roll with. And we picked up Treylon Burks to at least assuage the fact that we don't have much from a wide receiver standpoint, but this is what we've got, and we're going to go with this. And I think that's fine, but it's just that puts the timetable for Malik Willis essentially on hold. Like, can he get into a couple of games like here and there, especially if the Titans fall out of it? I mean, their defense can probably keep them as a contender within their own division, possibly sneak into a wild card if the Jaguars flounder again. I mean, it's entirely possible that they could be like in a similar situation to where they were last year. But if that doesn't work out, if Derrick Henry suffers another injury, or the passing game just doesn't really come back to where it was in years past, like without having Jay Brown, then sure we could possibly see Malik Willis. But just like you were saying earlier with the other guys, it's just if I don't see a plan or like I can't see a path to a person like that getting on the field, then it becomes harder and harder for us to trust or to believe in the value of that quarterback, like from a fantasy perspective, or wanting them on our roster. So, kind of like with Ridder, although I guess with Ridder, like we were saying earlier, we might be able to see him get on the field at some point and play 6 to 8 games, maybe.
Mhm.
For Willis, maybe a quarter of that might be in the cards for him. So I've just been
Maybe. I mean,
I've been avoiding him for the
stretch.
time being until there's just I don't know some reason for me to believe that's going to change, but I just don't see it right now.
So the Tennessee Titans are going to be this philosophical exercise that we could perhaps look upon for years to come because so many I mean people are torn on Twitter on in the sporting world on the Tennessee Titans right now all based on assumptions that we're making about the team that could be completely incorrect. Let's
Mhm.
start with the first assumption. So they traded away AJ Brown. Look, $100 million is a lot of money. Okay. So
Yeah.
I'm not saying you trade away your star players, okay, but they know his medical history better than we do. All right. And they know that $100 million is maybe something that you pay if you were a legitimate one seed last year, but they probably know internally that they were not the best team in the AFC last year. They had the best record in the AFC last year,
Sure.
gave them the one seed, but they
Mhm.
were not the best team in the AFC last year, and that was proven with how much they struggled to beat the Bengals. And of course, the Bengals had an excellent run and went on to the Super Bowl. And that was
Yeah.
fantastic.
It was.
But I don't know that they, at the time, starting the playoffs. I mean, Bengals had a tough go with the Raiders, then they had a tough go with the Titans, so they gritted their way out of it, but
Mhm.
that game against the Bengals doesn't show that the Titans were ready to pay $100 million for a receiver and then go win a Super Bowl. Okay, so the first assumption is that Treylon Burks was a one-for-one swap. Okay, Treylon Burks, sure, play style could whatever be compared close, I guess, to AJ Brown in that he's physical and pretty fast, and that's about it. So he's a pretty
Mhm.
big dude. He's pretty physical, but you can't rag on the Titans and tell them you didn't get A.J. Brown just because they drafted the guy.
Yeah.
No one from the Titans said, don't worry about the fact that we traded A.J. Brown. We got Treylon Burks. No one said that. They just drafted the dude. So, like, he's a good receiver. He went where he was supposed to go. He was going to go between 16 and 22. He went at, I think, 16,
Mhm.
right? And they drafted him, and I think he's an excellent fit. I was actually busy during this portion of the draft, and I thought that they drafted him with A.J. Brown. I said, whew, that's going to be a nightmare for defenses.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, they traded A.J. Brown and drafted him there. But I guess my rant here is that Treylon Burks was a perfectly viable pick. You don't have to pigeonhole them into saying that they replaced A.J. Brown with him. He's just a receiver that they drafted. He happened to be the receiver that was closest to A.J. Brown. And we'll also mention A.J. Brown panned out great, but he was a second-round pick. So it's not like Treylon Burks doesn't have A.J. Brown's ceiling. Everybody poo-poos all over this pick, and it makes absolutely no sense. He still has the same ceiling. He was drafted like 28 picks ahead of where A.J. Brown was drafted. Give the guy a chance, right? So then we go to our second assumption, and it's the Ryan Tannehill quotes came out where he said he's not going to, whatever he said, I'm not going to help him, or it's not my job, is what he said.
Mhm.
And then it forced Vrabel to come out and say whatever he said about the situation. Look, we don't even know that Malik Willis is in the cards for them in the future. They traded up for him, fair, but he was a third-round quarterback, and in the third round, you can draft backups. Actually, most of the time, a third-round pick is either a backup or out of the NFL in 2 years
Mhm.
at quarterback. So we don't even know that there's a plan for him. So that's why when you look at the guys that Malik Willis is sandwiched in between, he's sandwiched between Desmond Ridder and Matt Corral. And I start arguing with myself, do I want Malik Willis or Matt Corral? And that seems crazy in your head because if it's a running back or if it's a wide receiver or if it's tight end, you're going to bet on talent. You're going to bet on pre-draft evaluations. And with Malik Willis, he's maybe 2 times more talented than Matt Corral.
Mhm.
So, yeah, I mean, but the problem is quarterback's a whole different animal. If you can't get onto the football field, then it does not matter. So while Matt Corral, who we're going to get to in just a moment, might see the field this year, Malik Willis may never be a starter. Malik Willis could be Tyler Huntley, and that would be a good career. But
For him,
that,
not for
sure,
us.
not for us. But that's the problem. That's the question you have to ask yourself here is, do you want to make these assumptions about the Titans that
Mhm.
you've got Titan fans already asking for Malik Willis, and like give the guy a chance to play some football first. You might have gotten yourself a really good backup for Ryan Tannehill. You might have got yourself a good backup for your first round pick next year. But they took him in the third round for a reason. Every NFL team passed on him 2+ times.
Yeah.
So clearly he was not the threat to Ryan Tannehill. And it's not like we're talking about Sam Darnold. Ryan Tannehill is not Sam Darnold. Ryan
Well,
Tannehill is infinitely more.
that's true, and I would say that just like we're talking about earlier about the fact that we're all so down on Malik Willis just because of everything that happened within the last like few weeks regarding his
Yeah.
draft capital and situation. But if you got to think about it from a Titans fans perspective, the last time they saw their team played, their quarterback was throwing 3 picks against the Bengals. And the
And taking
reason that
sacks.
and taking sacks, the reason that they lost that game was
That's
because
fair.
of Ryan Tannehill, because their defense got 9 sacks on Joe Burrow. So,
Record.
like, yes, records. I watched every single one of those
Yep.
sacks. You can see the hat behind me for those watching the recording.
Yep.
So so there's a reason why like those folks are upset and at least want to have, I guess, some sort of idea of a plan for what's going to be different. Because the only thing they know to be different right now is they had lost their number one receiver, their only good receiver. So there probably is some concern. And the only, I guess my only pushback on the Treylon Burks, AJ Brown thing, it doesn't even come from me. This comes from Matt Harmon, noted wide receiver prognosticator Matt Harmon. This is from his reception perception sentence in the Treylon Burks profile on receptionperception.com. The AJ Brown comparisons are bad. That's
Yes,
literally what
I fully agree. I
yeah.
mean, they are.
He says that Burks's RP profile reminds him most of Juju Smith-Schuster.
That's great. And I love that. And Juju Smith-Schuster used to be physical. I
Yeah,
don't know what happened,
power
but he
slot
used to
player.
be
I can
physical.
100% see it, but just we want to, I guess, because of the draft capital, because everybody like looked at that. They were like, oh, look, he's got the same draft capital and he can play the same way. So he's like almost like similar sizes,
Well, and it
you
was the
know,
pick.
and the
Wasn't
pick
it
and
the
all that.
pick that they traded
Yeah. And just like
AJ
all, I
Brown
mean,
for?
yeah, like everything just kind of meshed together for everybody to say, like, Treylon Burks, AJ Brown, 1-for-1, like, and that's it. But if you
Right.
look at their deployment on the field, could not, I mean, it was almost I mean, not a night and day difference. Like, and while Treylon
They're just
Burks,
very different.
yeah, the way that they're used and the way that they win are different. So can Burks be a wide receiver one? Yes, but he's not going to win the same way that AJ Brown
Right.
would win, because AJ Brown can be an alpha wide receiver, and a Burks I think can be that in theory, but he's not going to be able to do it the same way that Brown did.
Well, and what really happened is that people just assumed that the Titans thought that and started sorry Joe and all over them. And the
Yeah, yeah,
the fact of the matter is the Titans never said that. And so it's just that guy sitting on his couch like pointing and laughing at the Titans. Haha, you think he could be AJ Brown? They didn't say that. They took a
right.
first round wide receiver in the first round. Leave him alone. And then that brings back to the therapy session we had earlier today about Malik Willis, and that you made a really good point. It's like if he went second overall or something, then Titans fans, yeah, call for Malik Willis.
Yeah.
Or not second overall, but wherever the Titans picked in the first round, call for Malik Willis. But he went in the third round for a reason, right? So what we need to do is take the Men in Black flasher out and forget that we ever thought that he'd be second overall or 30th overall or a first round pick in general. And look, we don't have to feel bad about ourselves. They invited the guy to the draft. Okay. They invited a mid third round pick
Yeah,
to the draft.
that's tough
So
scenes.
we were okay, we were wrong, but this is all educated guessing and wipe your hands clean. All right, now what are we looking at? Talented third round pick with a very tough path to start him. Moving on to next year.
Yeah.
Sorry. Bye, Malik
Send
Willis.
send a 2024 third for
Sure.
Malik Willis.
Sure.
Now, if you're that inclined to, or something like a late
Right.
round pick over the next like couple of years, if you're that inclined, because at
So
least the best part about it is that quarterbacks, like typically, like real life quarterbacks, typically retain their value. Like, shoot, we've seen Brian Hoyer like get moved multiple times, even though I guess it's just a Houston and back, but still, like
fair.
there. I mean, there's a way for backups to kind of move around the league, and so like if he can wind up getting traded or moved at some point in the future, he
Right.
could be, like you were saying, like a Tyler Huntley. I mean,
Well,
that's
here, let me ask
possible.
you, what's the difference between Malik Willis and Kellen Mond?
I think I would say coming out of college, Mond didn't have like the same, I guess, fantasy upside. I think from a pocket and like from a pocket or like a pocket passer standpoint, I think he was more refined there. But that's not what we care about for fantasy. With Malik Willis, we could see the fantasy upside if Malik Willis would be able to get on the field. I never saw that with Mond, not me personally. I never saw Mond being at least a part of the QB1 discussion if he had landed in a place like Seattle. Like if Seattle had drafted Malik, then I would have been at least more inclined to believe that that path is possible. I never saw that with Mond, regardless of where he would have landed.
Well, my point in the question is that the only difference is that Kellen Mond was drafted a whole round earlier.
Well, yeah.
So my point being is that we're going to talk a lot about Malik Willis right now, and then we're probably not going to talk a lot about him ever again. It's really sad. We all did a lot of work on him, but you
We're just
can't
hurt.
just
Everybody's just
yeah.
hurt.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. It just hurt. So, I still draft him late because his value obviously fell. So like still draft him late because he's still the most talented physically probably in this draft. I think Desmond Ritter's a little underrated in the physical category. I think he's going to be very valuable around the red zone, but either way, Ritter's ahead of him. Malik Willis is next, and then you've got Matt Corral, who's gone to the Panthers. And look, the Panthers still haven't acquired Baker Mayfield, and Baker Mayfield is an upgrade over Sam Darnold. Okay, let's not be ridiculous. However, maybe he's not a big enough upgrade for them to do anything to bring Baker Mayfield and his baggage over to Carolina. So we're looking at Sam Darnold versus Matt Corral going into the season, and this is another one where it's not a tough path for Matt Corral to get on the field. So what are you thinking about Matt Corral here at quarterback 4 off the board?
Well, it's not just Sure, I agree with the statement about the path for Corral getting snaps, like live snaps on the field this season. That's a fairly clear path to see because we already watched Carolina bring back Cam Newton and start over Sam Darnold just last year. So they're looking for other options under center. My problem is, what regime is Corral going to be looking at in 2023? Like, what is his development plan going to be? Because any of the other guys, like, there's really no concern about what that's going to look like. Mike Tomlin, he has a job for life. Vrabel, he's set. I mean, uh, even with Malik, no, not Malik, Desmond Ridder, like Arthur Smith, he just got there.
Yep.
So there's, I mean, but with Corral, I mean, Matt Rule is a dead man walking at this
Yeah,
point.
why is he even there? Why is he there
Right.
right now?
But the problem is that this current regime is the one that is now, like, they're tied to him.
Mhm.
So the next coaching staff that winds up coming in, they've got no allegiance to this third round quarterback that was drafted with poor traits. I
Yep.
mean, let's say not say poor. I'll just say questionable. How about that? But still, they have no allegiance to this third round pick. So even if we wind up telling ourselves a story, and it, like, even the story coming true of Corral wind up starting a few games, and let's say even if he looks, I don't know, passable, this next
Because what
the
if he's
next
Davis
coaching staff,
Mills?
yeah, I mean, but the next regime can come in and say, well, we don't like him. Let's go and get our guy because we don't want to have to mess with him. I mean, that's entirely possible. And with as aggressive of an owner that the Panthers have,
Mhm.
they could have just said, yeah, let's just go ahead. I mean, we've only got, I mean, DJ Moore's on his second contract, but he's not getting any younger. I mean, Robbie Anderson, I think he's good for 2023, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah.
But Christian McCaffrey, I mean, what he was supposed to do with, like, the core of this offense, if we're gonna have to wait like a whole, what, another 1 to 2 years in order
Right.
to get this thing like kickstarted again. So that's my concern with Corral. I've been pretty much out on the, like, not entire Panthers offense, but at least that situation, regardless of who would have gone there. I mean, it doesn't make any sense for me because, especially now with the draft capital assigned to him, there's just no reason for me to believe that whatever we see happens this year is going to at least provide a base jumping point for their workload to expand in 2023. I just don't see it happening.
Yeah, I guess I don't see we can copy and paste a lot of the stuff that we took from the Desmond Ridder conversation and put it here, though, with Matt Corral. Like I said before, a lot of the first question you need to ask is predicated around how is this guy going to see the field?
Yeah.
And then you need to talk about, are they going to be good on the field? If Matt Rule manages to save his job somehow, then I guess that works out for Matt Corral because obviously he drafted Matt Corral. Um, but I guess the point is that Sam Darnold's probably worse than Marcus Mariota at this point. I mean, he's a zero. He's a zero. He's gonna add nothing. He adds nothing with his legs, even though he had this weird amount of rushing touchdowns at the beginning of last year.
6 within the
Um,
first 5 weeks, if memory serves.
yeah, really, really strange. I think they were all within the 10 or something weird like that.
Yeah.
And then, so, I mean, maybe it's weird. Maybe it's weird to say Marcus Mariota is better, having seen so little from Marcus Mariota. But my point is, if Sam Darnold adds nothing and Matt Corral adds nothing, then just play Matt Corral. If Sam Darnold adds nothing and Matt Corral adds a little bit, play Matt Corral. So my point here is that if you're a dead man walking and you need to do something to keep your job, you drafted this quarterback. When you get to week 3 and you're 0-3 and Sam Darnold has 2 picks a game or whatever he's averaging, you just throw Matt Corral in. I mean, they were running 2 quarterbacks over Sam Darnold. I didn't know Sam Darnold was back from injury because
Didn't PJ Walker wind up getting in there at some point too?
they ran. There was a game where PJ Walker and Cam Newton took design snaps, and Sam Darnold was active, and I
Yeah,
did
that's
not
right. They
know.
did the QB platoon.
Yes, and Sam Darnold did not play.
Yeah.
He played the next week, but he came back active and sat behind Cam Newton and PJ Walker, who both played in the football game.
Yeah.
So I don't
What a
see
mess.
how Matt Corral doesn't get on the football field. That's why it's so weird this year, like to remove our priors, because we have to think about third round quarterbacks in a way that we never have before. And if Matt Corral was a first round pick like we thought he might be, then this conversation is so much easier. Everything makes sense in the world.
Mhm.
But since he's a third round pick, we have to have the same conversation we would have had if he was a first round pick. But then We have to adjust for the fact that he wasn't a first round pick. He was a third round pick. So what do they think about him? I
Yeah,
think that the dude probably deserves to play over Sam Darnold at some point in 2022.
sure.
But they might not because they took him in the third round. So that's the tough decision you have to make. And I it's going to be a tough decision when you're on the clock and you have Malik Willis and Matt Corral there, and you're looking at someone like Pierre Strong or Matt Corral. It's like,
Yeah.
oh, what do I do? Because I mean, you can write narratives where Damian Harris gets traded, and then Pierre Strong becomes Ramondre Stevenson, and then that's got value. And like you can write narratives for all these late second, early third round picks, but not all of them are quarterbacks.
Yeah.
So then you have to break the tie with quarterback, and I say good Matt Corral. I've been taking lots of Matt Corral, lots of Desmond Ridder. I've been passing on a lot of Malik Willis, and I will fully admit, I'll admit it again and again. He's the most talented quarterback in this class. More talented than Kenny Pickett, I believe. But I'm going to keep on passing on him, and maybe I'll get kicked for it. So we'll run through these last two quarterbacks in rapid succession because they were both late and probably not going to be super relevant. And then we've got a little bit of news to get to at the end in the NFL that we missed because I was out. So we'll start with Bailey Zappe getting drafted before Sam Howell. He's going to play for the Patriots. I mean, he's not taking Mac Jones' job. He's probably just going to be kicking Jarrett Stidham to the curb. So, any interest in drafting Bailey Zappe whatsoever at any point?
No, but I will give it to the fact that he is probably one of the smartest quarterbacks like in the league. I would almost envision him to who is it?
Ryan
Kellen
Fitzpatrick?
Moore. No, I was gonna say
Yeah.
Kellen Moore actually.
Oh,
Uh,
yeah, yeah.
highly intelligent, like football IQ, like type of player, but essentially just has like a pop gun from an arm for an arm.
Yeah.
So I just don't see him getting on the field too much, but I can almost see him essentially like carrying a clipboard for a few years and then just becoming a coach at some point. Like he really does
Yep.
have like the mindset to be a good leader and to also at least like understand like what's going around like on the field. But he doesn't have the proper mental processor one, and then also like the arm strength in order to get him out of those types of situations that he will need to. And also he's not mobile either. So I think all those things, like, no, I don't see him being a starter, but I think he could be a good coach at some point.
Yeah, I echo all those sentiments. I just don't think that he physically has what it takes to be an NFL quarterback, even a backup, to be honest with you. So I could
Mhm.
definitely see that in a few years. Bailey
Be fun to
Zappi
watch
being the
him
coach.
and like Mac Jones like in camp together, because you know how like we see those videos of like Aaron Rodgers like backing up and like
Yep.
throwing like the deep balls into the bucket. I think like him and Mac Jones could probably recreate like the same thing, but
Yep.
never in a game situation. Like it'll always have to be like against air or something like that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Which leads us to our last guy, Sam Howell. Sam Howell, we thought was going to be in the conversation probably for the second round. So he was like the guy that was always falling off of that quarterback list when we thought it was going to be a monster first round, where we thought there might be four quarterbacks drafted. He was always going to be the odd man out, probably make it into the second round. Well, he makes it to the fifth or sixth round. I don't even
Fifth
remember.
round.
Fifth round to the Washington Commanders. And look, I could see him playing some football. Now he has to beat out Taylor Heineke. That's the tough part for Sam Howell. So Sam Howell first has to make the roster, okay? And if he makes
Yeah.
the roster, he might play some football this year because one, Carson Wentz is known to have his injuries. Um, he'll play through them, but Carson Wentz could miss some time for sure. Maybe a little bit more likely than some others. And then two, Carson Wentz is just also not good. Um, so there's that as well. So if watch for Sam Howell to make the roster first. I mean, fifth round pick's not guaranteed to make the roster, especially quarterback when you can only carry so many.
Yeah.
And then secondly, watch for him to beat out Taylor Heineke because if he manages to beat out Taylor Heineke, then look, you got a chance to see the field because Taylor Heineke right now for damn sure has a chance to see the field. He he could win a job over Carson Wentz for all I'm concerned. Um, so if Sam Howell's able to beat out Taylor Heineke, then I could maybe he can beat out Carson Wentz. I don't know. So do you have anything on Sam Howell?
Just the thought came to me right now. what if, I know it's in the same conference, but like what if like the 49ers wind up doing some sort of deal, send Jimmy Garoppolo to the Commanders like towards the end of the season when Wentz is doing bad, and they get back like Taylor Heineke? Because it almost seems like Taylor Heineke would
Sure.
be like the perfect fit for
Yeah.
like a Shanahan type offense.
Yeah.
So like kind of sit behind Trey Lance, assuming like he's going to be their starter for this year, which I
Wouldn't
think
have
is
to
the
change
case.
the lineup too much,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
or the offense too much. I mean, he's not as mobile as Trey Lance, of course, but
Sure.
he's crazy enough to
I mean,
run
hell,
that
if
offense.
Cliff Kingsbury can make it work with freaking Colt McCoy,
Yeah, true.
I think Shanahan can work with Taylor Heineke. But all right,
Very true.
but back to Sam Howell. I think this is more of like they want options. Like
Mhm.
they want to be able to evaluate more options. And while they wound up picking Carson Wentz, I think we can both agree that Carson Wentz is better than Taylor Heineke. Like he might not be,
For
at
now,
least for
yes.
now, and they and that's what they needed at the position.
Mhm.
Because after watching, essentially a full season of Heineke, it's just like good, like let's say
He's
below.
exciting. That's about
He's
it.
exciting. He can, but it's just Carson Wentz. Like if given the right situation and told to just like calm down,
Yep.
yes, and kept within
Sure.
structure,
Then it's
yes,
more that's more fair to say. I mean, he can be
yeah,
competent. He's not as bad as Sam Darnold. So
right. Because for all the crap that we give him, he was able to pilot the Eagles for at least 3 quarters of a season on their Super Bowl run before Nick Foles
Mhm.
wound up taking over. I mean, that was a different era, like different part of his like development arc,
Well,
so on
hell,
and
he
so
led
forth.
the Colts on a decent run before he literally was the sole proprietor of their demise.
Yeah. So there's that. You get the two sides of the coin, like the
Mhm.
Carson Wentz coin. So I think like for right now, the Commanders they want bodies, like they want options. They want to be able to evaluate these guys and see what their long-term plan is going to be. Because if Wentz isn't going to be in the cards for them, and with his contract situation, it doesn't look like it's going to be the case, then they need to have like better options. And even if they do wind up keeping Wentz, they need to have a better, I guess, break glass in case of emergency, or
Yeah.
like developmental players behind them. Because sure, they wound up hitting on Taylor Heineke, who was fine, but they just need to be able to have like more of those players like in the rotation.
Yeah.
So I think that that's essentially what they're looking for right now. Like Carson Wentz will be their starter this year, but they need to have a better success plan or successor plan like
Yep.
for them, like for 2023 and beyond.
Yep. All right. So we're gonna pivot off quarterbacks, leaving off with Sam Howell, and we're gonna go into the conversation about DeAndre Hopkins, who has a 6-game suspension for not necessarily PEDs, just banned substances. They didn't say PEDs as far as I've seen. So just banned substances. He is claimed his innocence, but he has dropped his appeal. So we'll see what comes of that. He swears that he's going to find answers, but either way, he is suspended for 6 games. And the Arizona Cardinals traded for Marquise Brown. I was out the past couple weeks due to illness, so I did not get to talk about this much right after it happened. But this became more interesting. Maybe the Cardinals already knew about this. A lot of insiders have said teams know about this well ahead of time. So it seems as though the
Mhm.
Cardinals kind of knew about this. The weird thing is just that the Cardinals didn't trade for AJ Brown, right? That's the only thing. It's something weird like 8 minutes after the Marquise Brown trade, a first was sent for Marquise Brown and then a first was sent for AJ Brown some 8 minutes later, which means that the Cardinals had the opportunity for AJ Brown for the same same trade. However, nobody likes to mention that AJ Brown would have cost significantly more money, and they're already paying DeAndre Hopkins a ton of money. So I digress, but that leads me into the ranking situation. How do you look at Marquise Brown going forward? How do you look at DeAndre Hopkins going forward? I updated my rankings today. You can find those at footballguys.com. Finally back on track after being sick for a while, and I finally moved Marquise Brown over DeAndre Hopkins. So Brown moved up just a little bit, and DeAndre Hopkins finally moved down far enough to where he had been surpassed by Hollywood Brown. It's just going to be, I mean, you could see the Julio Jones like collapse for DeAndre Hopkins from here out. So it's tough to see upside. What do you think about Hopkins going forward? We'll start there.
No, I think Hopkins, for our purposes, should be fine because at least he's suspended, but he's not
Not getting
injured.
hurt.
Right. So at least the value proposition, or at least the proposition for 2022, and even for well, no, just I'll just leave it at 2022. But the value proposition for DeAndre Hopkins in 2022 was that we were going to wind up losing him for a few games anyway, almost
Fair.
like how we were approaching the 2021 season for Julio Jones. And all right, so if I already know I'm going to wind up losing DeAndre Hopkins for injury, now we're already getting the missed games out of the way. I mean, we're losing him for 6 games, and he's going to come back healthy. And he's going to come back to a situation where even if their Marquise Brown plays on the outside on one side, DeAndre Hopkins is not going to be sitting for 34-year-old AJ Green. For as much as I love my former
Mhm,
Bengal, AJ
mhm,
Green, it is going to be those two on the outside,
mhm.
or even if they want to play AJ Green on one side, DeAndre Hopkins on the other side, and move Marquise Brown to the slot,
I think all 3 could play the slot.
they could. But Brown and Hopkins are going to be like the number one and number two
Mhm,
targets. I mean, even if you want to try and factor in Zach Ertz.
mhm,
So I'm not as worried about DeAndre Hopkins, at least for 2022. I mean, 2023, what AJ Green, his contract runs out at that point, and the
mhm.
team is already strapped for cash as it is. So it essentially just rolls back to how it was beforehand. And now DeAndre Hopkins doesn't have to be the primary target and taking on all of the coverage, defensive coverage. So, all right, I don't mind that. Like for a player that, for the most part, I would assume most folks were comfortable with having him football die on their rosters anyway. I don't think most folks were trying to trade away DeAndre Hopkins at this point.
Well,
And if you
the
were going to, you probably would have done it by now.
the problem is he was still, like, hanging on to the top 20, and this happens with all of them. Julio Jones' collapse was actually, maybe a little bit faster than we expected,
Very much
but
faster.
with DeAndre Hopkins, um, Odell Beckham,
Mm-hmm.
Sammy Watkins, all these guys where their careers were clearly going downhill, their name value held them within the top 20-ish. So maybe you can make the argument that DeAndre Hopkins already should have fell below some of those guys with a lot of upside. Your Michael Pittman's a good example. Like really probably should have been behind Michael Pittman anyways. Did if he didn't get the 6-game suspension, would I have done that? I probably wouldn't have. I probably would have let him ride in the top 20 for another 1 year. And then
Mm-hmm.
next year I would have been behind the curve and I would have had to drop him to like the 100th overall player or something because it became evident. Now the only problem is if you make the assumption that he misses that 6 game and comes back healthy, that's the first thing I thought too because I'm playing so much best ball. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, now you're taking a risk in best ball because you don't know if the drop in ADP is enough. So you know you're getting him a value because you're losing him for 6 games. You don't know if it's enough value because you don't know if he's still going to miss those games. So what happens when he comes back healthy after his 6 games and then he still gets injured as he does for 6 more? And then
Mm.
so you don't know if you're putting him in bubble wrap or if he's just going to come back and still get injured the same way he would have get injured anyways. So it's a very tough proposition. In Dynasty, it's a proposition you don't really need to make when you could pivot to Marquise Brown, who's 25, I believe. And he's shown enough promise. He's gotten another contract. So when you look at that, you say, yeah, I probably would prefer Michael Pittman. I probably would prefer Marquise Brown. So it's that pivot point. It's that getting off point. You can't trade him right now. But
No.
and I don't understand this, but the Cardinals were significantly worse without him on the field. Like way worse than they should have been just because they lost their wide receiver one. And in more ways than just the passing game too. So it's just something about him being off the field affects Kyler in such a way that the offense just can't get it done. So if he comes on the field and gets a massive resurgence for that offense, you might get another trade window. But there's only going to be one more.
Mm.
So if you've got DeAndre Hopkins, you're probably waiting to trade him in week 8.
Yeah, more than likely. Like I was saying beforehand, I mean, most folks had probably made that decision last year that, especially when the year started, because he was still getting like a similar target share, so on and so forth, that they're just going to let him football die on their roster. And that's
Which
just
is fair.
going to be the end of it. Now with the injury, I 100% agree that there's a chance that a opportunity or at least a window would be open for you to trade them to a possible contender that's looking to make that late season push, and they can go from there. But otherwise, I still think, yeah, after 2023, because like you were saying, I mean, yeah, the Cardinals flail without him because look at the guys that are sitting behind him.
Yeah.
But Antoine Wesley, he's like, while a fine like
Hey,
jump ball, like
he made
he's
me a lot
fine.
of money in showdown, sir.
Sure, contested catches and all that. Like he can do like some of those like flashy plays, but he's not a consistent player within the offense. Rondell Moore had an average depth of target of 1.2 last year. So, and they whiffed on Andy Isabella. It's like, and their running backs, like as of right now, are like an older James Conner and Hoomst afterwards, Benjamin. I mean, so it's just like
Deontay Ingram.
So I get why, like the Cardinals have, and of course, if you want to bring in put on your tinfoil hat and think about, a short quarterback not being able to connect with receivers that are not like, at least relatively like somewhat taller than him or like bigger body targets. That's a conversation for another day, I guess. But I think the point being, though, like DeAndre Hopkins, I still think that his value at least should be sustained. Of course, we have to contextualize his age and then the injury history, of course, because once you are injured for this amount, like the probability that you're going to be injured again becomes that much higher. So, of course, that also needs to be factored into his long-term outlook. I mean, and for him at 29 years of age, I think he'll be 29 at the start of the season.
Mhm.
We've only got a few more years left, unless his role changes. And I think that's always been the case for older wide receivers.
Yeah, make him Larry Fitzgerald. Fine.
Yeah, unless like if you want to start moving him inside more instead of having him play the perimeter, instead of having him run or have an average depth of target like of 10, 11, 12 yards, then okay, yes, then he's probably only has like 2 years left. But if you want to preserve him because you don't have many other options, like heck, they didn't even have too much draft capital this season in order to really like replenish their roster. And they don't have any cash to do it either in free agency. So I guess it would make some sense like for them to try and, shift what he does in order to allow him to still like be a productive member of that offense. And with them moving for Marquise Brown, who primarily plays on the outside, who can still create after the catch. I think Marquise Brown had more yards after the catch than any pass catcher on the Cardinals last year, except for Rondell Moore, who again had an average depth of target of less than 2 yards.
Yeah, which is right. So yeah, his
So it's just
differential was pretty easy to achieve.
yeah. So I mean, but so that I can still, with all that being said, I can still talk myself into Hopkins having at least a decent amount of value. I mean, less than years past, but still a decent amount of dynasty value for the next few years.
Sure. Well, that's going to do it for today. Thank you for joining us for the Dynasty newsletter. Please like, subscribe, rate, review, and we will catch y'all next week.
Peace.